Dream Tower Media presents The Literary Wonder and Adventure Show, hosted by Robert Zoltan, with Edgar the Raven.
Howdy do.
This episode, Clark Ashton Smith, Poet of the Fantastic, a conversation with author Ryan Harvey. In Averoigne, the enchantress weaves weird spells that call a changeling sun, or hail the moon of Hecate down to the ivy-hooded towers. At evening, from her nightshade bowers, the bidden vipers creep to be the envoys of her malison, and filters drained from tomb-fat leaves drip through her silver sleeves. In Averoigne, swart phantoms flown from pestilent moat and stagnant lake glide through the garish festival in torchlit cities far from time. Whether for death or birth, the chime of changeless bells equivocal clangs forth, while carven satyrs make with mouths of sullen, somber stone unending, silent moan. In Averoigne abides the mage, so deep the silence of his cell, life hears the termless monarchies that walk with thunder-echoing shoon in iron castles past the moon, fast-moted with eternities, and hears the shrewish laughter's swell of Norns that plot the impested age and wars that sons shall wage. In Averoigne the Lamia sings to lyres restored from tombs antique, and lets her coiling tresses fall before a necromantic glass. She sees her vein-drawn lovers pass. Faintly they cry to her, and all the bale they find, the bliss they seek, is echoed in the tarnished strings that tell archaic things.
Can I turn this wind machine off now?
Oh, sure, go ahead. I'm finished.
I like that poem. Who wrote it?
Clark Ashton Smith. He's the subject of our episode today.
Who's our guest?
Who's our guest? Didn't you check the show schedule?
I've been kind of busy.
Too busy to check the show schedule? Busy doing what?
Collecting shiny objects.
Collecting shiny objects. My friend, keep your mind on the work, and maybe we'll win a shiny object called a Hugo Award.
I don't think they give Hugos for podcasts.
Oh. I think you're right. I guess the work will have to be its own reward. Again.
But you told me we'd make loads of money with this gig.
Oh, that. Yeah. I guess I lied.
You lied?
Sorry, I needed a co-host.
What else did you lie about?
Well, now that you mention it, remember when I said, oh, hey, that's our guest now.
Wait, remember when you said what?
Flashing red light, it's showtime. We'll talk about it later. Oh, hey, man, how's it going? Come on in.
Thanks, I'm good.
Hey, it's Ryan Harvey.
Hi, Edgar.
Hey, Ryan. How's your love life?
Edgar. Well, welcome back to the show, man. It's good to have you back. Today we're going to talk about one of your favorite authors, Clark Ashton Smith. And I was kind of excited about this conversation because I don't know a lot about him. I have really loved some of his stories. And he was really a poet, mainly. And poets don't get enough attention and respect, in my opinion, in America, in our culture.
Or money.
or money, like much anything. Well, though he got women, I guess, but we'll talk about that. But so I'm looking forward to having this conversation about Clark Ashton Smith, poet of the fantastic, as I call him. So why don't we just start off by telling me a little bit about his background.
Well, first of all, he would be very happy that you called him a poet first. That is, he's best known today for his short stories, and that's certainly what I like him the most for. But poetry was always what he felt was his major calling in life. He lived almost his entire life in Northern California. He was born in Long Valley, California in 1893, and then moved to Auburn, California, where his father built the house that he lived in, a cabin. And he lived in Auburn for most of his life until the very end when he got married at age 61 and moved to Pacific Grove. That area, Auburn, which today is a bedroom community for Sacramento, is a gateway to the Placerville mining district. It's very beautiful redwood country, kind of what we would call John Muir country. But Smith himself was always in a very different headspace. He felt it was kind of a provincial place because he was a poet who was drawn very early on to a movement occurring in Carmel by the Sea, where the poet George Sterling had started to gather a kind of a bohemian society around him of Decadents. They were known as the West Coast Romantics, and Sterling introduced Clark Ashton Smith to a lot of his favorite poets, such as Baudelaire, who was one of the big influences on Smith. And for a brief time, as even a teenager, Smith became a really celebrated West Coast poet. And then that whole world, the Carmel by the Sea, the West Coast Romantics, that all just kind of vanished eventually. And Smith, he began writing short stories, principally to support his parents, from about a short period from late 20s, like 1929 to roughly 1934, when he was principally a short story writer, and then just stopped and lived on until 1961, and with only occasional returns to short stories, did nothing more than write poems and sculpt and paint.
So that period most people know him for, is writing these fantastic stories, was really only like a 5, 6, 7 year period.
The first of his weird short stories that he sold to a magazine was 1926, a story called The Abominations of Yondo, which he sold to a local magazine called the Overland Monthly. And H.P. Lovecraft, who was his pen pal at the time, and for the rest of Lovecraft's life, encouraged Smith to sell his stories to Weird Tales. And he got into Weird Tales, and for a period of about 5 years, he, H.P. Lovecraft, and Robert E. Howard, who were also all pen pals, were the major focus of the magazine. And Smith sold a lot of stories at this time. And then in 1934, 1935, right at the same time that both Howard and Lovecraft stopped writing, although for very different reasons, Smith just no longer needed to support his parents. His mother died in 35, his father died in 37, and he just lost interest in writing prose.
Yeah, no, so Howard took his own life, then Lovecraft, you said, died of Bright's disease?
Bright's disease. Yeah.
And then Smith's parents died, and then that's why he stopped kind of writing, because he didn't have to write anymore because he got some money then, right?
He didn't
have to.
He was always kind of he was always kind of living in poverty. He supported himself at times by picking fruit, cutting lumber. He occasionally worked for the local Auburn newspaper, doing some journalism or typing. But he lived in this little small cabin with no indoor plumbing. Wow. I've seen where the house used to stand in Auburn. It's on a street that's now called Poet Smith. It's now a boring suburban community. Most of Auburn is pretty much a suburban community for people who don't want to be living in Sacramento.
Oh, I see. That's quite a change. And because you said it was built by his parents, a cabin in the woods?
Yeah, his father built the cabin that they lived in Auburn. And the cabin burned down while Smith was still alive, which was kind of heartbreaking to him.
Oh, it must have been. It would have been like a little museum now if it would have lasted.
I don't think it would have lasted. It was probably
probably mowed it down with the suburbs.
Yeah, if you look at Auburn today, it's like part of Auburn is still very much honors its gold rush history. It was a major gold rush time. It was a gateway to the Placerville mining district. And there's still parts of it that resemble an old mining town, and it's charming. And then you get to the Targets and the Walmarts.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the whole area of Sacramento that was a big gold rush area. You talked about Baudelaire, and I'm reading this book now called The Decadents. That's about the artists, and especially the artists, visual artists, but the painters, but also the poets that inspired them, and writers of the last quarter of the 19th century in France. That's what I thought of when I was preparing for the show. I thought that Smith reminded me a little bit of Baudelaire, The Flowers of Evil, that collection of Baudelaire's poetry. And Baudelaire was one of the Decadents, one of the inspirations for the painters of the Decadents, the painters like Moreau so that's the connection between the Decadents in France and around that same time, the Decadents. I mean, that's when Poe lived also in America. Poe was pretty much almost like a decadent in America, and I also feel there's a real kinship between Baudelaire and Poe.
Yeah, and also another important influence on Smith was Algernon Swinburne, who was one of the key members of the Decadents, a guy who enjoyed people thinking that he was a lot more sexually depraved than he actually was.
Yeah, it was a big thing back then to appear to have this bizarre personal life in order to enhance your reputation as a poet or a painter. Yeah. And Desaad being the ultimate example, I guess.
Yes.
But Smith was a little bit of a little decadent. You said that you mentioned he did well with the ladies, I suppose. Because he wasn't married.
He didn't get married until he was 61. Right. He married a reasonably well-off woman named Carol James Dorman, and they then moved to Pacific Grove, which was then and is today a very wealthy community. Mm-hmm. He lived remaining about 10 years of his life. He still wasn't writing any poetry. He had 3 children because he married into a woman who had already been married and had 3 kids. I spoke to his one of his stepsons years ago. I called him because he's the one who oversees Cassiana Literary Enterprises, CAS, Clark Ashton Smith's initials, Cassiana, which is they handle the rights to Smith's stories and poems. It doesn't bring obviously a lot of money, but every once in a while someone wants to make some sort of adaptation. And I talked to him, and it was just funny to hear him refer to Clark Ashton Smith as Smitty. Smitty was this way. He apparently just sounded like a very relaxed guy in those last years of his life.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a flowery, elaborate, romantic, like Lord Byron type of title.
Smitty.
Interesting. So he was very young when he was writing the poetry. His first poetry book came out, was that The Star Treader?
The Star Treader and others. Yeah.
And he was 19 when it came out.
But
some of the poems he wrote when he was 14, he was considered a prodigy.
Yeah, he was self-taught because his parents didn't send him to high school as he had a fear of crowds. So
which would simply be called social anxiety.
Social anxiety today, which I get it. Mm-hmm. I completely get it.
Well, a lot of people suffer from it. I think it's gotten worse with the crowded cities. It's interesting. He suffered from it, but he lived in a cabin in the woods.
Yeah, and he was self-educated there. His parents essentially had him read the dictionary, and then he read the Encyclopedia Britannica, and he was fascinated with the dictionary. We would today think, reading the dictionary, how boring. But for him, every word had its etymology, and he would become fascinated by it, which is why his own poetry and his own prose is completely chock full of unusual, odd words. Mm-hmm. Usually, and often, you mentioned before I even arrived here, you had written to me about how you found the word demonian an interesting variation. He wouldn't say it was demonic. It was demonian, or it was demoniac IAC at the end. Mm-hmm. He would like unusual variants on words. He would not talk about prostitutes. He would talk about lemans, chatelaines, odelisks, a word that I've never heard anyone else use.
Mm-hmm. What in your opinion, is the purpose of doing that? Why do you think he was doing that? I mean, some people would put something like that down and say, well, you're just obscuring the language. Why use these? Why not just say whore or prostitute? I mean, I have my own answer for that, but I just wanted to bring that up for you because, a lot of people just accuse someone like that of overriding or flowery language.
Well, first of all, if you want to put the book down, put the book down. It's like you don't deserve Clark Ashton Smith.
Well, why use? I don't even want to try to come up with an example, but why use a synonym? Why use?
I use odalisque instead of prostitute.
Well, yeah, that's an extreme one. If you only have one word for things, the more words you have for something, the more all those words are not the same. Synonyms are not words that are the same. They're words that are similar. The more words you have, the more descriptive you can be, the more human emotions you can express. Language is, and it's an abstraction already. And if you're going to write well, you have to have a wide range of expression or else the human experience becomes narrow and also it's just the writing is false because it doesn't represent the wide range of human emotion and experience.
Well, there is a big difference in looking for synonyms between finding synonyms for common, useful, and invisible words that you probably shouldn't be writing synonyms for. The favorite example of mine is the word said. When someone tries to get cute by changing the word said to objected, commented, ejaculated was one they used in the 30s quite a bit.
Yes.
It's
distractive.
It's terrible.
But you don't want to read the word leaped or leapt 5 times in a row when you can say sprang, because sprang is something they're all a little bit different. That's the thing, is we lose the nuances of these words.
You have to, as a writer, you have to know when to experiment with your language, when to make language fresh. And for Smith, you'd say, okay, what was the purpose of using these words? It's really simple. He liked them.
Yes, and also he was, I think that, and it wasn't for the reason I brought up. He liked them, and why did he like them? He was trying to evoke an archaic, ancient sense of mystery to the stories.
And his language does change from story to story. He does write stories that take place usually in the modern world, often dealing with a character who is a poet, who then finds a gateway to a strange world. It's a really common story of his. And usually those stories won't be as heavy with the strange, unusual words until later. On the other hand, you have a story like the opening of The Empire of the Necromancers, the first of his Zothique stories. That opening paragraph is an assault of words that are supposed to make you feel the world is decaying and incredibly ancient. And it talks about how the stars come out in fury at eventide.
Do you want to read it? Why don't you read it?
I was
just about to reread that when
I will now read the opening paragraph of The Empire of the Necromancers, because there's no better introduction to Smith's style. Muatmoir and Sodosma were necromancers who came from the dark isle of Nat to practice their baleful arts in Tinarath, beyond the shrunken seas. But they did not prosper in Tinarath, for death was deemed a holy thing by the people of that grey country, and the nothingness of the tomb was not lightly to be desecrated, and the raising up of the dead by necromancy was held an abomination. The first word, Muatmoir, a character's name, has 2 M's at the front.
Yeah, that's...
Who starts a story with that? Even the prelude to this, the legend of Muatmoir and Sodosma shall arise only in the latter cycles of earth, when the glad legends of the prime have been forgotten.
I have to say, I was about to reread the story, and there's one thing, I read the first page, and then I actually ended up reading The Beast of Averoigne instead. But I'm not crazy about that name. That name did throw me a bit. But that's just a name.
It's daring, 2 M's? What is that?
Yeah, it's not easy to say.
I mean, that first sentence has not only Muatmoir and Sodosma, but Nat and Tinarath, these fictional names, and that's the first sentence.
And it's also, you're talking about heavy with, like, references to decay, and so that's like Poe, he seems to be not obsessed with it, but I mean, there was a reader criticized, I don't know if it was Wonder Stories or what magazine, but criticized Smith. And what is it that he said about Smith?
No one ever loved a corpse more than Clark Ashton Smith.
No one loved a corpse since Poe, more than Clark Ashton Smith. So where did that come from? Because he was still pretty young, only mid-30s when he was writing the stories.
There's a couple of reasons. I would always say that his parents being so ill all the time, and he had to take care of them was part of it. But also, he peaked early, at least in his own estimation, as a poet. When he was 19, he got all this notice, especially in California, for The Star Treader and others. It was a very important, considered a really important poetic statement. And then the rest of his career was a disappointment compared to that.
And he may have had high hopes then.
I think he
because he really got
saw
some
himself,
recognition. Yeah.
like maybe going to Paris or something.
Yes.
And becoming one of the great decadents. And he spent the rest of his life, except for the very end, in Auburn, California, living in a small cabin, writing short stories, which he didn't think was really dignified for a poet.
And he was doing that
to support his parents.
Yeah. And that's, I don't think that, well, if any artist knows, it's like, I don't think that he would have had a problem living in a small cabin in Auburn if he was a celebrated poet.
Probably not. No.
You could always go to visit San Francisco for a weekend if
he would. Although his stories often take place in bizarre worlds, there are a few of them that take place around the Placerville mining district. And although he wasn't obsessed with his hometown the way Lovecraft was, Lovecraft enjoyed long descriptions of places in New England. When Smith would start describing the Sierra Nevadas, it's pretty poetic.
Genus Loci?
Genus Loci.
That takes place.
That takes place. It transports to another world, but he describes the Malakoff diggings at one point, and I've been to the Malakoff diggings, and they are surreal. They do feel like another world. Wow. And he also...
These are leftover mines?
It's an old... it was an old hydraulic mining area where they blasted the walls of this canyon with these huge hoses, and then they would get the gold from the water that came down from it. And because they went right down to the bedrock, nothing has grown on these cliff sides for 150 years.
Wow!
So it's a very alien landscape with a massive swamp at the center because the water just resided there.
Oh,
it's just filled the sound of insects there will almost deafen you.
And it's probably the sound's bouncing off the rock.
It is. It is one of the most surreal places I've ever visited, and I was there. I said, I'm getting some of Clark Ashton Smith's personal inspiration. It wasn't just other poets. He did find poetry up in the Sierra Nevadas. It's, John Muir spilled thousands of words about that area, and it did get into his poetry. I think his Martian stories, some of it, he said his Mars stories were influenced by forest fires. He would see the sky be blackened out and turn red. And then he would imagine Mars.
Oh, interesting. So you're saying maybe it is his fascination with decay and death, so his parents, but also possibly, he said, the loss of his perceived or real loss of his career as a poet.
And the community that was at Carmel. He didn't live at Carmel, but he visited a lot. And George Sterling, strong, good friend of his, the man had probably the most influence on his own direction, a great poet himself, the man who introduced him to Baudelaire and Swinburne. And once that community just
And what was the name of the poem by George Sterling that was huge? Kind of.
A Wine of Wizardry.
Yeah, it was kind of a launching pad for him, wasn't it?
Yeah, and Sterling
Smith
is not well known at all today outside of Northern California. There's a tradition in California. We've mentioned Jack London and San Francisco, and then this Carmel by the sea.
Which was only about 10, 15 years before that.
Yeah, and like all these communities, they didn't last very long. They were...
there's always this idea of bringing artists together, but artists never seem to work that well together, and such things just never last. Have you heard of the Studio? Was it the very end of the 60s, early 70s? Like Jeff Jones, Mike Kaluta, Barry Windsor Smith, and one other artist, I forget. And they were like four of the greatest artists at that time. And it was called The Studio, and it was like the Beatles at that time for those guys to get together, but they never created any kind of like really fantastic work from it, and they went their separate ways.
It's tradition. There is a tradition in the U.S. of that happening. It's the communal settlements of the 19th century that were designed to create a perfect communal living experience.
A utopian.
Yeah, the utopian movement of the 19th century. They would last 4 to 5 years.
Yeah, and then you realize you're living with other people you don't like, and then you realize that you have emotions about them that aren't very utopian. It becomes quite disillusioning.
Perfection is hard to achieve.
Well, and also there's the fact of artists having to spend a lot of time alone. So it's almost you need, like most human beings, but I think artists are a focused version of that, where you need friendship, you need love, you need other people around, but then you need so much of the time alone, and it's very hard to balance those two things.
Well, this is why I think the correspondence with Lovecraft was so important. Right as that world in Carmel by the sea was vanishing and the 20s started, and Smith was now waiting for his big poetry break to just keep carrying on, and it didn't happen, that's when H.P. Lovecraft wrote to him. And it's strange. People think of Lovecraft as being the center of all this pen pals, but He wrote to Smith. Smith didn't write to him. Lovecraft had read his poetry and wrote to him, and they began a correspondence that lasted up until Lovecraft died. I think that filled an important need for Smith. He had that kind of friend he could talk to.
Yeah.
And later Howard.
After losing maybe those other friends and having the pain of his poetry career kind of slump.
Although Lovecraft would not have liked Carmel by the Sea. The sexual decadence that they were trying to achieve somewhat would have not been Lovecraft.
Just too much sunshine, probably, too.
Lovecraft would have hated California.
This is interesting because most people, and I also had been guilty of thinking of Smith coming from Lovecraft, coming after, but so wasn't he actually... He was really writing the poetry before Lovecraft was writing, right?
Well, Lovecraft was writing in the teens as well.
Around the same time, okay.
He had his own juvenile.
But he was he was writing, trying to write some kind of fantastic tales, or Lord Dunsany.
Yeah, Lord Dunsany. The two places where they intersected is both of them loved the Arabian Nights.
Yeah. So how did I see? Go ahead. No.
Yeah,
continue.
the Richard Burton translation of the Arabian Nights. If you want to talk about a decadent individual, Sir Richard Burton is just crazy.
Well, that work is like.
Yeah, well,
the unedited
version
is just.
They were
unbelievable.
They both were loved the Arabian Nights and both wrote their own juvenile Arabian Nights adventures. That's where the name Abdul al-Azrad for Lovecraft comes from. It's a name he gave himself in his little Arabian Nights games he was playing.
And that's supposedly the author, the fictional author of the Necronomicon.
Fictional author of the equally fictional Necronomicon.
That's interesting. So both Smith and Lovecraft both wrote their version of Arabian Nights tales.
Yeah,
interesting.
Smith wrote 2 short novels when he was 14 called Black Diamonds and The Sword of Zagan, which weren't published until the early 2000s. And they read like a talented 14-year-old wrote them. They're essentially kind of a form of fan fiction.
Right.
And he was also heavily influenced by Vathek by William Beckford, which is a weird work. You can see a lot of his interest with diablerie and death in Smith's own writing, which is the attraction to the corpse idea.
Yeah.
That's where Smith really diverges from both Lovecraft and Howard, and he is necromantic.
And Dunsany.
And Dunsany as well, yes. And you can see a lot of that in the bizarre decadence of Beckford's Vathek. There's a scene where Caliph Vathek has to kill 50 children and throw them into a chasm. And this is just kind of very lightly touched upon. Hey, he's just killing 50 children and throwing them into a chasm. That kind of craziness.
Only happens in the Bible.
But with Beckford, there's also a slight sniggering, like he, I'm getting away with this.
Yeah, a naughty child.
And Smith really took that to heart, and there was just an obsession with the adornments of the tomb and the crypts. The word cerements is one of his favorite words. It's tomb wrappings. He loves that. Cerecloth, cerements.
Yeah, interesting. I wonder how. I mean, my parents are very old now, and facing the possible loss of your parents is really difficult. And yeah, I wonder how difficult that was for Smith, and how much, like you're saying, that if that affected all of these things we talked about, loss of his friends, a poetry career, but also his parents, maybe knowing they weren't going to be around much longer, was maybe just. I mean, for the Decadents, there was an element of the beauty of horror. And I get that much more from Smith, of that idea.
Yes. When you get to what's considered probably his best story, I don't know if I fully agree. We all have our very idiosyncratic loves. If you're a Smith fan, you talk to different Smith fans, and that all have a particular one they gravitate towards. But the one that kind of would get the vote for top if everybody was polled is the Dark Eidolon, which is a parade of dead things.
And this is one of your favorites, or your favorite?
It is among one of my favorites. It is one of his best written. It is a simple concept of an evil wizard wants revenge on a king who embarrassed him when he was a child. He rode his horse over him when he was a young boy, so he spent the rest of his life learning evil necromantic wizardry to get revenge on the king, and his revenge is to just bring a gigantic tower into the middle of the king's city and invite the king to a feast where he proceeds to have just an army of various liches, mummies, weird monsters parade in front of him and perform various decadent activities. Then eventually imprison the king's spirit into a statue of an evil dark god. But the evil dark god is kind of ticked off at the wizard for not actually going to him or asking for his help in the first place. He lets the king kill the wizard, and then great horses come from the sky and trample the tower at the end.
And then, and on the other end, we had talked about this a little bit before this conversation of that. Another thing that he has similar with Poe is his sense of humor. And some of my favorite stories by him are well, I mean, when you have somebody that writes a story called "The Theft of the 39 Girdles," somebody has a sense of humor.
The Satampra stories are pretty funny. The Satampra, the tale of Satampra, which is the first of the Hyperborean stories, and the Hyperborean stories have a lot of dry, sardonic humor to them.
And he wrote these, and that's a long time ago. And you look at, they almost look like stereotyped fantasy stories, like the tale of
Satampra.
That almost looks like, and yet he wrote it, this is like the 30s.
Yeah, its plot sounds like it's generic fantasy. Two thieves go out to steal things, and they stop by an ancient city, and they encounter an evil god there, and they run away from it.
Yeah, what would Robert E. Howard have done without, I mean, that was around the same time? Was he writing?
Yeah.
Was it before?
They were right at the same time, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm amazed, too, the Howard, that these things that have become such tropes that they pulled from prior adventure stories, and like, say, Arabian Nights and the idea of lost civilizations. I just want to mention one other story that I love by Smith that I never read until I happened upon a really super old anthology called Swords and Sorcery that had his story, The Testament of Athammaus. Mm-hmm. That story reminded me of a story, an old Chinese fairy tale, I think, called The Seven Chinese Brothers.
Yes, the brothers who are set to be executed, and because they're identical, they can each go one at a time, and each one has a specific invulnerability.
Yes, and each one went in place for that execution. They took each other's place so that they would survive the drowning or whatever.
The Testament of Athammaus is essentially a joke, an executioner who just cannot execute this one guy.
But it's a wonderful story, and you know what else it reminded me of? The story felt to me very far ahead of its time because the ending reminded me of Akira.
Yes,
the Japanese animated movie Akira.
Very weirdly so.
I was very surprised by the story. It's very humorous. It's exciting. It's strange. It may be my favorite story by him, and I just know it's not really a typical Smith story. Is there such a thing?
Well, the Hyperborean stories all kind of share that kind of humor. That's a key story.
Irony.
Yeah, they're very ironic. That's he often has very strange, funny narrators there. Satampra is a humorous narrator. Mm-hmm. He's a thief and a drunkard, and he's trying to make himself sound better than he actually is, and doesn't do a very good job of it. I'd say the key humor story of the Hyperborean cycle is the Seven Geases. Gesh is an Irish word meaning a magical compulsion placed on somebody.
And that's spelled Geas, like geese.
Looks like geese.
Yeah, geese. Seven geese.
The seven Geshes is a story that is a perfect example of Smith's aversion to the idea of plot. Mm-hmm. It is a man while hunting in a mountain encounters a witch who curses him, tells him to go see the toad god Zathagawa. This is one of Smith's most important inventions for the Lovecraft mythos, because Lovecraft adopted the toad god Zathagawa, but Zathagawa is kind of a mocking deity, not really like Lovecraft's cosmic deities.
Who lack a sense of humor.
Yeah, this one actually talks to you.
Yeah.
So this hunter goes to Zathagawa to apparently be killed, but Zathagawa looks at him and says, "No, I'm not going to kill you. I'm going to instead send you to Auburn, the spider god, and he will do something for you." So he's sent to Auburn, and the story is essentially he goes from one entity to another who just sends him to another entity 7 times as this guy just keeps wandering around from place to place. And it ends with a punchline. I'm not going to say it here, but that's kind of a make it or break it point for how well you're going to like Clark Ashton Smith as a whole, because you either read that and say, that's amazing. This story was just filled with so much strange weirdness, and it ends on like a hilarious black joke. Or else you say, what was the point of that?
Well, see, I would think that for myself, I think it's because of the movie industry. I just feel like it's important to have a story, but plot and story are two different things. There's a lot of ways to tell a story, and there's a lot of ways to write without telling even a complete story, writing a vignette that has meaning. There's great writers that have written great stories, great tales, without being obsessed with this idea of a beginning, middle, ending, and it has to have some rational reason and resolution. I think there's way too much emphasis on that and not more emphasis on great writing. Because I think Smith proves that if you're a great writer, you don't have to follow any rules, and you don't have to have a traditional idea necessarily of a plot. And other writers did that were great.
Yeah, he would come up with an impression, and most of his stories can be summed up in almost one sentence.
Well, I was going to say Poe is another good example. Yeah. Poe's, if you read, I could tell you that the plots are pretty...
Well, let's distinguish between story and plot, because they're often used like they're the same thing. Plot is the sequence of events that make up a story. When you're talking about a plot, you're talking about twists, turns, how things are ordered, and how information is escalated or de-escalated. Story is the overall tale you're told, and also includes everything that happens before and after. It includes the encompassing everything of which the plot is conveying.
The question would be: so can you have a story without plot?
Yes, I would call the Seven Geases a story with no plot. I think it's a great story. Because it calls into play so many different gods and entities. A world unfolds before you. There's a sensation, and it is a story to say a man goes into the mountains and is forced to visit various deities.
Yeah, things happen.
And so someone says, what's the plot? Well, there is no plot because there is no progression of events. He goes from one to the other.
Yeah.
And what's the climax? The climax is literally, there isn't one.
Right. And Poe, some of his stories had more plot than others, but the plot was never the most important thing. When I think of my favorite stories by Poe, now The Fall of the House of Usher, it does kind of have a plot in the sense that there is something very exact that goes on, this sequence of events that's very powerful. But when I think of,
Pen and the Pendulum. Pen and the Pendulum is one event. Casa Amontillado. Guy wants revenge. He puts a guy up in a wall, walls it up.
Right. And then you don't need to read. I don't need to read the story. Then you just told me the plot. Well, no, the experience is the words themselves. Is the story is the use of language, is the words that are the story that's told.
The Cask of Amontillado was specifically written to criticize an author who did not like Poe's style.
I think I heard that.
Yes, who felt that Poe said you don't need a whole novel to tell this kind of story. And this man says disagreed, and so Poe, who actually made fun of the guy in the story by using direct references to him, very early on when the joke about that guy wouldn't know Amontillado from sherry. Well, Amontillado is sherry.
So what we're talking about now is the use of language is the story sometimes.
Yes.
And Lawrence Durrell, one of my favorite writers, wrote the Alexandria Quartet. Justine, especially, the first book, is not an easy book. There are times when you're reading his long paragraphs, and it's not like Faulkner long paragraphs. It's not like long run-on sentence like Faulkner or something like that. Not to criticize Faulkner. Don't write
that hack.
That hack. Didn't even know where to put a period. Some people just don't know when to shut up. But Durrell, you're reading this long paragraph, and there's a conversation going on, but you're not even sure who's talking. And when I first read it, it was a little bit, I got lost. It was a little bit irritating, but it was his way of writing it. And once, as I went into the quartet, I understood it more and more, and I didn't find it difficult to read at all. And I don't know if the other books were easier than Justine, or if I just started to comprehend the characters. The point is that great writing, I want to read a great writer. If somebody's going to tell me, there's not a lot of story, there's not a lot of plot to it, I'm interested in reading great writing. And if I can read great writing, whether there's a plot or not becomes secondary.
Well, you know what has a lot of plot? The Da Vinci Code. You know what has no interest to me?
The Da Vinci Code. Well, there's too many books to list. And I don't know if I mentioned, I think that the movies require, a great movie also wouldn't necessarily require a plot also, but our mainstream movies that require money to be large amounts of money to be made we are going for the lowest common denominator, and so you want to try to tell some. Everybody loves an entertaining story or a good joke, but some of my favorite movies are the same way. Vertigo definitely has a plot. Oh, it does. However, the movie could be 15 minutes long. There's a lot of the Jimmy Stewart driving around after Kim Novak in a car and all these things that you could. That is a movie, but in the same way, language. It's mood, atmosphere, emotion. So many things are going on that pull you into this story.
My example would be Stanley Kubrick's film Barry Lyndon. It does have a lot of story to it. It takes place over a long stretch of a man's life, but the purpose of the movie is to give you the chance to exist in the 18th century. The sensation of that world is what is most important to that movie. To insert you into that and to create a sensation around you that you live in a time period in which the movement of time is different. And it succeeds brilliantly at that.
Well, you could have just mentioned 2001, no?
I could have mentioned 2001, but Barry Lyndon needs to be talked about more.
Yes, well, I was going to say, everybody, well, a lot of people haven't probably seen 2001, sadly, or maybe seen, I saw part of it. That's a movie where however, it's like a good book. How much you give into that, it's going to give you back. That's what I feel. And if you're not willing to go beyond that first page, that may be a little bit difficult. You may be missing one of the greatest treasures of your life.
Yeah. Clark Ashton Smith, and this is something that Ray Bradbury said about him, was a lonely writer for lonely tastes. He wrote in a style that could simply never make him a bestseller. I'm very glad that he is in print now because Penguin is doing these editions of a lot of classic weird tale writers, and they have an edition called The Dark Eidolon out. So easy to get.
When did that come out?
That's about 2 or 3 years ago.
That's really great because I love the penguin thing with Lovecraft, and there's a little tentacle going after the penguin on the front. That's so cute. I'm glad they did Smith.
They did Smith as well.
That's excellent. I'm glad there's a bookstore around here. Not going to mention the name. I'm really happy they've thrived. I'm a huge fan of that. I'm irritated because they say they don't carry genre fiction, even though they have a section of science fiction and fantasy. It's this snooty attitude that they don't. Only if somebody's super, I guess, famous and they're with a giant company, then they'll carry it, and then it's not considered genre, but it is genre fiction. Or maybe it shouldn't be genre fiction. And I'm excited that a company like Penguin, putting out these kind of masterworks of great writers, they're putting out some writers that are considered quote unquote genre writers. And then the literary bookstores have to put it in there suddenly.
Yes, they now have to stock a Charles Beaumont collection and a Richard Matheson collection as well.
Yes, and you see J.G. Ballard, but now they have to have now you see Lovecraft. But it's also thanks to some wonderful people. Not my favorite writer. I like his books. I've read several of them. Michael Chabon. Really like the Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. But, he's been a great champion for that, of breaking down the idea of genre, of just a good writer is a good writer. He's written some great essays about that. He's a huge Fritz Leiber fan.
He's also a huge M.R. James fan. He wrote an introduction to an M.R. James collection, which is also available from Penguin.
Again, we go back. What do we go back to? We were just talking about well-written tale. I'm happy to read a well-written tale about something like, Updike, middle-class existence of somebody experiencing something. Though Updike's a lot stranger than I thought he was when I finally read him.
Not my thing.
Not your thing. I was surprised by some of his stories being actually quite strange and reminding me of Bradbury, a couple of his stories. I expected something different. But the point is, I don't care if there's an elf in it or there's a middle-aged guy who's, getting divorced from his wife. I want to read good writing. And we all have our likes and dislikes and favorite things. I tend to like reading about eras before cars. That's why I like fantasy. It's also why I read turn of the century factual travel books, because I like the time before cars.
It's nice to read in Smith. Smith doesn't talk about horses. He talks about palfreys and coursers. And for example, this is in the Dark Eidolon. The evil wizard, when a young boy, is ridden down by the current prince. But he doesn't write him down with just any horse. It's described as a palfrey. And a palfrey is specifically a non-war horse, riding horse, or one even more specifically, a light gait horse for a woman.
Now see, that has a huge amount of meaning.
And in the rest of the book, the horses that are charging through and trampling the city are referred to as coursers, which are charge horses.
So if he would have used simply the word horse, a huge amount of meaning, humor, would have been lost in the story.
I'd also say, and because Smith just liked words in general, palfrey is a great word. It kind of gives that sensation. It seems smaller than courser.
Yeah, because it sounds like paltry.
there's a beauty to language, and I am someone who, I don't know how, I feel sometimes that a lot of people who are writing today don't seem to love words enough.
I agree.
And it depresses me. I
think that's what I was talking about plot. I think they're upset. They want to create some great plot for a story so they can get option for a movie. And you can't translate beautiful language into a movie unless you're a very fantastic director. That does Fellini, Kubrick. It does happen occasionally, but it's still a different thing.
This is why poor books often make great movies.
Yeah, it's true. You don't have to have a great book to make a great movie. You need a great plot. You need great things to happen that will translate well into the visual medium. Yeah. But for me, I feel very much that's for me is what it is. I do love the language and the writers that I go back to. But as like anyone, I do also love an entertaining story. I do have trouble with some writers
I don't want to say that I am completely against the idea of plot. I love the James Bond novels by Ian Fleming, but he was also a fantastic writer.
He was,
but he created extremely good twists and turns, and he could just drag you through the story so fast.
Well, Dashiell Hammett too. Dashiell Hammett was an incredibly spare writer, and he's absolutely fantastic. Yeah. And Chandler was almost his opposite, and I love both of them.
Could not tell a plot very well.
No, but he didn't need to.
But he didn't need to. Yeah, you don't read a Chandler story to find out who did it.
I realize that. Well, you know what I do like? What I was surprised about Chandler, I think his short stories are way much better in that sense. Yeah, I was impressed with his short stories.
But if you read the early ones, they're not very good. It's only when you get to the end, like Red Wind.
No, that's what I'm talking about.
The early ones are very clumsy. He once said he couldn't get his characters out of the room with their hats on.
No, but I love the one. There's about 4 of them, and there were some of them were almost proto novels. It was like Red Wind. There's one
Red Wind, Goldfish.
Goldfish. I read that was the last one I read.
Fingerman.
Those I was blown away by those. I thought those were as good as Hammett when it comes to plot action story. But yeah, you're right. When I go back and I read The Big Sleep again, I want to reread The Long Goodbye.
The Long Goodbye, I think, is the best novel of the 20th century.
The best novel? I think you said before you thought the best detective novel. You think the best novel?
I think it's the
best American novel or novel?
Novel.
Really?
Yeah. I have often said I don't want to say I have a favorite something. Like, what's your favorite movie, someone says. And I would say I don't have one. I have about 200.
Yeah.
What's your favorite novel? I have quite a few of those. And sometimes with novels, it's often hard to even conjure up. There's so many of them in my head. And because you don't visit them as much as you can visit a movie, it's easy to sit down and watch a movie quickly. Mm-hmm. But I've kind of come to this realization over the last 5 years or so. It's like, I don't think you can write something better than The Long Goodbye.
We're off subject, but before we leave it, I want to ask you why. Do you know?
Yes, I know.
Do you partly know?
I partly know. Yeah, one cannot fully know. The Long Goodbye is the Shakespeare work of Southern California. Its depth of understanding of the characters and the people who exist in that world is stronger than any other work I've ever come across.
In his world, because it isn't really what it was. It's his idea of the world. It is very much partly the world. I'm not putting it down by saying that. Right. Every writer, that writes about something, I agree with you about that. About it being it's prototypical. This amazing, mythical picture of Los Angeles in his mind about that. Los Angeles.
It's also him processing his wife dying. And his own pain. There is very little between you and the author in that story, and you in feeling Chandler's own pain. It portrays sadness and regret better than any book I've come across, and those are emotions that I find powerful in writing, as in my favorite author of all time, Cornell Woolrich. So The Long Goodbye is a genre story, a detective story that becomes transcendent literature without ceasing to become a detective story. It's not trying to be better than the detective story. Mm-hmm. It just manages to be the best version ever you could have written of that kind of story.
I simply think he was writing the story he wanted to write, and he was at the height of his ability.
He even apologized to his publishers, saying there's not much mystery to the mystery in this one. Mm-hmm. It is easily one of his least complicated storylines.
Well, getting back, thanks for sharing your feelings about that. I love that novel too, and I feel the same way. When you live in Southern California, I think it's very hard to capture the feeling of a place, even if you lived there for a while, because what is it that makes a place a place? Is it the people? Is it it's all these different things combined but they have to be processed through someone who can use language or film as a medium or whatever to express something that is kind of ineffable. So getting back to Smith about that, you mentioned Sadness and Regret, which is a huge part of Smith's work. But Smith, I think there was one Night Gallery episode that was based on.
Oh, it's based on The Return of the Sorcerer.
Yes, I liked that a lot. But would Smith? That's the question. Would Smith make good movies? Well, probably he mostly wrote short fiction, so that's.
He actually said when he submitted the Dark Eidolon to Weird Tales, he wrote to Lovecraft and said, I think this would make a pretty good movie. They could do it with the special effects of the time. My answer is, no, they can't. No one would make this. I feel that Smith's best medium is animation. I think animated short films based on his could be astonishing.
You know what? I think that, well, as someone who's doing complete full on audio dramas now with music and everything, I think of course audiobooks now are becoming very popular, and I think some of the people just are not meant to be read, and I think that Smith is to be read by good readers for audiobooks, and even the audio dramas would not be too complicated. They mostly would be music and narration, because there wasn't a lot of conversation in Smith's books.
No, and conversation was purposely arc whenever it happened.
Well, I think that language, the radio show, the old radio show, is that evocative feel of music and words to me is not something less than a movie. It's something different, and that's what I think his work is the best for. Actually,
I'm stumped for animation here. I think that with narration and very artists who are interested in creating very impressionistic styles of animation could just go crazy with Smith stuff.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't see it with orthodox animation, but
no.
It wouldn't even have to be animation. I think it could be painting stills also. And I've seen some Poe stuff online and people reading stories and some pretty fantastic paintings. So, closing, I guess I'm going to ask you a hard one. One easy one would be Are there collections of his poetry in print still?
Well, the Penguin collection that is out now is...
so that's that has poetry in it?
That is poetry in it, too. It has some of his best poems in it.
So that might be a good thing for the poet, because it has poetry and stories.
I do, yeah, that Penguin collection, it isn't the best collection of Smith's work I've seen, but it's in print, it's extremely good, it is inexpensive, and it's got his poetry in it as well.
And yeah, because the British Masterworks is out of print.
Yeah, it's out of print, and my favorite collection, A Rendezvous in Averoigne, an Arkham House collection, is also out of print.
Yes, most of them are out of print.
I'm not sure about the contents of... I always my judgment is like, what are my favorite stories here? Like, I feel that if you don't have Colossus of Averoigne, which is probably my favorite Smith short story, I kind of feel like you're missing out on one of his more epic fantasy stories. Mm-hmm. It's still very much a Smith story, but it's the closest he got to what we would call a sword and sorcery story.
Didn't that... you ever read Hellboy? I think that really inspired one of the Hellboy stories.
It might have, I don't know.
There's a Colossus in the Hellboy story that's made... I think that he must have read Smith and pulled from him a lot.
Oh, I'm sure he did.
Yeah. Because he's got a lot of stories, like even like the Beast of Averoigne sounds just like a Hellboy. Just put Hellboy in there, basically, and have Hellboy beat the monster up instead of what happened. And it's just like a hell. Could you give me maybe your top 5 Smith stories?
This is loose, but these are top 5 for various reasons. The Colossus of Averoigne, the Dark Eidolon, which seems to be on top of a lot of people's lists, The Empire of the Necromancers, which was the first Zothique story, The Seven Geases, which is the hilarious Hyperborea joke story. The Seed from the Sepulchre is not one I particularly love, but in terms of just getting scared by a story of his, that one's right there. It's really grotesque.
What about the one that I love, The Testament of...
Testament of Athammaus? I like that one, but not as much as from Hyperborea, as much as Seven Geases.
And The Tale of Satara.
The Tale of Satara. Yeah, I do like that one.
It's pretty famous. It's been in several anthologies, right? Yeah.
I really love his main Martian story, in the Vaults of Yovambis, which is often used as an example of how Smith could combine science fiction, fantasy, and horror into a singular story. And that one's pretty fantastic. I would say probably my favorite is Colossus of Averoigne. It's It's one of his longest stories. I like that we got a really epic tale out of him that's still just filled with so much dead necromantic imagery. Also, I love giant monsters. It's about a giant monster.
All right. Fair enough. So, we talked about an Acolyte of Black Spires, and that's part of your Ahn-Tarqa series. And that was your work. I can tell has been influenced by Smith. Not you don't write like him, but especially the Empire of the Necromancers and some of the stories that you're the shapers in your stories.
Well, the Shapers, I almost feel when I look back on it, their first inspiration was an illustration by Harry Clarke for Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death. That's where they came from. They look like that image, holding a mask.
But what they do, to me, they have a feel, most of it, Clark Ashton Smith feel of their culture of this kind of like Empire of the Necromancers, kind of decadence.
Yeah, they themselves are not quite decadent. They're remorseful.
Well, decadent in the sense of. They're kind of, I guess it's strange. Aren't they trying to build things? They're making things, but I mean, decadent in the sense of they're not trying to evolve or build a utopia, or maybe they are in their own way.
They're investigating their own sadness.
They're walking down almost like a dark dead end.
Yes, that's.
Like, yeah. But if someone wants to read your Acolyte of Black Spires is in the Writers of the Future anthology
27.
What?
Volume 27.
Oh, volume 27. And then you have another story you self-published.
Right, which is Farewell to Tyrion. You can get it on Amazon. I have a new story that just came out in a magazine, Stupefying Stories, which is a comedy science fiction story, so we can be less grim for a second,
Yay.
called The Invasion Will Be Alphabetized.
Oh, you told me about that story.
Yes, it's
congratulations.
Stupefying Stories, number 19. You can get it on Amazon as well.
And when are we going to see your book, Turn Over the Moon, the novel, Ahn-Tarqa novel? This is what I'm going to torture you about after we talk later.
I actually been going through it recently and making some revisions to it because it's been a couple of years since I've visited it, and I'm still very happy with most of it. I found a few places where I think I can slightly make the narrative a little more exciting, and just some language changes. I got better at language.
Okay, well, Ryan, thanks for coming out and talking about Clark Ashton Smith. It's been fun to have you again.
Before we go, I would just like to recite a number of bizarre words Clark Ashton Smith used in one of his stories because I think that's a good way to go out. So,
Edgar, what do you think?
Go for it.
All right, good.
So in no particular order: thaumaturgy, Lehman, Simum.
Okay, well, let's just kind of head towards the door as you do that.
All right. Lehman, thaumaturgy, Simum, Odalisque, Portico, Unctious, Loci, Archaic, Portia, Punge, Jasper, Turpitude,